Okay, welcome back from a long hiatus. It's been way too long since I revisited organizational work conditions. In fact, the first time I uploaded these videos, I omitted the health and safety section of this portion of the syllabus. So let's correct this error, no pun intended, right now by talking about health and safety. Under this bullet point, there are three key subheadings. The first one is accidents at work, errors and accidents in operator machine systems. Now, this subheading is a little strange relative to what we usually see on the syllabus in that they don't provide any sort of sources to read. There's nothing in brackets or parentheses to look for. So that means it's largely up to the textbook writers and to the individual teachers to choose what to talk about when we talk about operator machine systems and their potential failures. So keep that in mind. If you read one textbook and then read a different one, they may refer to different authors or primary sources. The way I handle it is I talk about things that people might recognize, some big accidents in history. We could talk about COVID, but I think we've had enough COVID this last year, so let's talk about something else. Let's talk about, for example, accidents in nuclear power plants. There are two famous examples, one being, of course, Chernobyl, and the other one being an American incident called the 3 Mile Island incident. You might be familiar with either of these. Maybe I'm just old and I remember them more clearly. But that's a nice way to start, is to think about where this applies in real situations. Nowadays, there are many more safety measures at nuclear power plants, so much so that they're much safer than people reckon, despite the recent Fukushima disaster in Japan. So before we get into the specifics of some historical events, let's talk first about the term operator machine system. Very easily put, the operator machine system has basic elements. Some of them are human, and some of them, of course, are machine. The human is the operator. The system, or the machine, comes out displaying information in two key ways. One is the actual visual display, and the others are the controls and how they are labeled. According to someone named Riggio, who's quite often referred to in the blue textbook, the light blue textbook, there are several types of errors that occur in a machine operator system. These could be errors of omission, where you forget to do something, errors of commission, where you purposely do something, sequencing errors, where you do things in the wrong sequence or the wrong order, and timing errors. So here is one source that a textbook chooses to use in Riggio. You're welcome to know this, not too difficult to memorize, especially since omission and commission rhyme. Moving on to what I just talked about, the 3 Mile Island incident, this could be used as a clear demonstration of a lapse in machine operator system design, or even just human error. This kind of goes very hand in hand in some ways with what we discussed already with groupthink. You could argue that some of these overlap with groupthink behaviors. But essentially, what happened at 3 Mile Island is that people tried to clear a clog in a water pipe with a relief valve. And the valve never closed. And what happened was an alarm went off. And it seemed that the workers were so inured to hearing alarms that they didn't really pay it much mind. Think about the way you hear an car alarm these days. Car alarms are everywhere, and so we don't even react sometimes when we hear them. Another issue was that the warning light was not very specific to what the problem was. It was more of like a general alarm. So that might be a problem with the machine design rather than the operator. But there is an operator element to this, of course, in that they didn't pay it any mind. So the machine is really was scapegoated as part of the big problem here. There are over 1,600 gauges in that system, and sometimes the colors that indicated dangers were different in different places. Maybe sometimes it'll be yellow, sometimes it'll be red. So there was a lack of consistent design in this machine. But of course, the machine itself is not to blame. How the humans reacted to the machine is also a key element. A famous model for the mistakes that are made between machines and humans is called the Swiss cheese model. And I like to use this one in my class because I think it's an easy to understand metaphor of how there's a perfect storm of events that lead to errors and catastrophe. James Reason in 2000 proposed that there are two causes of accidents: people and systems, very similar to what we just talked about, operators and machines. So there is a human approach and there is a system approach. The human approach is a matter of free will. And so oftentimes when there's a tragedy, we get more upset at the person than at the system. We want to scapegoat a person because that is something that makes us feel good because errors, we believe, are an act of free will. But human errors should be expected. We are not perfect machines. We're not AI just yet. So we should see the human part as a consequence of design rather than the cause of the error. The human is usually the last element of a cascading failure. If you were to, you could pause the slide and read it in your own time. I might move a little quickly. But if we were to actually extrapolate this into paper questions, maybe paper 4, it's been a while since I've taught this, you might say, well, this could be used on two evaluative levels. We could use this to evaluate something based on situational versus individual factors, or we could also even couch it in free will versus deterministic factors. So if you're looking for something to talk about when it comes to workplace safety, in those two evaluative topics, then or those two issues and debates, you're welcome to use Reason from 2000. Let me do a close-up of the Swiss cheese metaphor, and maybe that'll make it clear about how this works. There are several walls that need to be penetrated for errors to occur. So usually it's not just a one-time thing. One thing leads to another, leads to another, leads to another. And things have to align just perfectly for all the fail-safes to be missed. And that's why he uses Swiss cheese. Those holes have to align just right. So the early holes have to do with an organizational failure. And then there's a component failure. And then maybe there's a user interface confusion. Maybe your HUD or your visual design is not clear about what is trying to be expressed there. Think about the 3 Mile Island gauges and the lights that weren't very clearly communicating to the employees what was exactly happening at the nuclear power plant. And the last step is the human error, maybe ignoring those warnings. Reason calls the first 3 latent failures. Those are failures that are under the surface, whereas the last failure is more of an act of free will. Again, it's more of an active failure. So in order to propose solutions, you have to look at it in 2 different ways. For the latent failures, you could look at system solutions. For the active failures, you could look at hiring or training people better, and those are people solutions. So again, this portion of the syllabus doesn't come with any prescribed reading, but you have 2 that you could use right here. You have Reason and you have Reggio. And here are some quotes from the Reason article that I pulled out that you might find interesting to read on your own time. Just looking at the last quote, what Reason is saying essentially is that the most functional organizations, the organizations that have the highest reliability, constantly practice failure. Think about the school you go to and how many times you practice things such as fire safety drills, or unfortunately in some schools in America, you now have these school shooting drills. If you're part of those, I apologize for having to undergo such an ordeal, but this is the world we live in, unfortunately. All right, so anyway, yeah, there are several modern examples you could look at where there's a combination of design and free will that leads to disaster. And as I said earlier, you could make a link between some of the disasters that are mentioned when you talk about machine operator systems and things such as groupthink. For example, here, Reason mentions that part of the reason why human error occurs is there's an overconfidence based on low incident rates of things that have happened in the past. So the absence of catastrophic failure will give people a sense of, as Janice would say, invulnerability. And if you haven't studied the Irving Janis section yet for groupthink, this is a preview for what will come in the syllabus later on. And the same kind of things we just talked about, again, could be applied to the Chernobyl situation. These are grand scale catastrophes. Of course, most of us will work in smaller organizations, and our failures will not be as, hopefully, newsworthy. Okay, the second portion of the syllabus has to do with making work conditions safer in a mining facility. So what are some ways that we can make workplaces safer? Well, we could post graphs that show how many incidents of disaster or accidents have happened recently. Or we could do things like give feedback to people about how they're performing and if they're performing dangerously. Or what we're going to talk about in more detail is we could use a token economy to change behavior. For those people who have studied abnormal psychology, you should have studied the Paul and Lenz study that talks about using a token economy to get schizophrenics to behave in a more socially acceptable way, for lack of a better term. Token economies are also sometimes called contingency management. If you've ever seen the term contingency management, it's very similar to a token economy, and these two things are often used interchangeably. This study by Fox is sort of like a natural experiment because these are things that the company wanted to employ anyway. This is a very hard thing for a psychologist to get involved with and manipulate variables. So what we're trying to do with these two mines, one is a coal mine, I believe, and one is a uranium mine, is we're trying to reduce the accidents in each. Not just deaths, but also just injury in general. Injuries are very costly, not just to the person suffering it, but to the company that has to cover the medical expense. So if we were in charge of a mine, what could we do to reduce accidents? Well, again, at these two facilities, one of them was in Arizona, that was a coal facility, and one of them was Wyoming, that was a uranium facility. We try to incentivize people to be safer by giving them some sort of token. In this case, more specifically, it's a stamp. So if they behave in a safe way, not just themselves, but ensuring the safety of others, they will be rewarded stamps. And the type of worker you were actually had something to do with how many stamps you got. So for example, if you were in an office position, you were put in group 1, which was a least hazard position. Whereas if you were actually in the mine themselves operating heavy machinery, you were in group number 4. This is a longitudinal study. It spans over a decade each. Okay, so for the Wyoming mine, 72 to 83, and Arizona, 75 to 85. I believe it would have continued longer, but I think the mines had been closed, if I remember correctly. Okay, so a little bit more detail on how the stamps are allocated by your position. So as I said before, group 1 was low hazard. That would be something like an office worker. And then group 2 was a little bit more hazardous. You maybe were a supervisor. Group 3, you were a maintenance person, someone who fixed things. And group 4, you were maybe like a scraper operator. You operated like one of those big machines that scrapes the ground or the earth or the rock. So the stamps you got were for safe conditions, a lack of incidents, stuff of that sort. And you got different stamps based on what mine you were at. So it's a little bit confusing if you want to memorize this stuff. So for example, if you were in group 4, you got 600 stamps per month at the coal mine, but 800 per month at the, I'm sorry, I made that mistake. 600 for the uranium, 800 for the coal. I don't like memorizing things. That's not my favorite thing to do. I like to get a general picture, but I know some students really like to have the details in their essays, so please feel free to pause this. What could you do with these stamps? Well, there are various things you can buy at like a company store or something like that, or maybe like some sort of catalog. For 3,000 stamps, you can get a beautiful spice rack. For 7,600, you get a comforter. And for considerably more, you get a gas-fired barbecue. So what is the moral of this story? As I like to tell students, spice racks save lives. Get a t-shirt made of it. It's a true story. The data is overwhelmingly convincing that the program did work, not just in terms of saving people an arm or a leg, literally, but also saving money for the company. I hate to say it, but companies are interested in making money. I mean, that's why companies exist. Safety first is a nice little gesture or thing to say, but honestly, companies exist because they need to make profit. So by having less people injured, like I said, there's less medical costs. There's also less days lost by the employees. So you're saving money that way. You're having a more efficient mine. So on all measurable scales, this was successful. And again, the conclusion I make is spice racks are powerful motivators in saving lives. Okay, so what is an evaluative point you could make about this study? Without knowing too much detail in terms of how it was conducted, I think you could easily say that this study has quite high application for dangerous positions, and maybe you could transfer some of these ideas to other types of dangerous jobs, such as working in a nuclear power plant or anything that involves heavy machinery, construction, or something like that. And as I mentioned earlier, there are some connections you can make between this study and the one done by Paul and Lentz in 1977, because they both have to do with token economies. There's also another crossover. I believe this is also mentioned in the health psychology units, or at least one unit, having to do with promoting healthy or less dangerous conditions. So I know this study sometimes is asked about for the health elective. Okay, moving on to the last subheading of this portion of the syllabus, we have a study on chip pan fires. And for those students who speak American, that just translates into French fry deep fryer. Making chips or fries at home could be dangerous. Who knew? My parents would not let me have chips or fries when I was a youngin' because it was not healthy. So I'd have to sneak off to McDonald's to get my fry fix. So for those making fries at home, be careful. This part of the syllabus could actually save your life. You could see some statistics here that show you how dangerous they can be. In 1981, there were 21 deaths in the UK due to chip pan fires. But look at those injuries, about 1,400 injuries nearly. And 31% of fires in the UK are actually due to chip pan fires. So there's a lot of tragedy associated with this way of cooking, and also property damage as well. Now, it's worth spending taxpayer dollars to address this because there's so much loss in property. And so this study, again, is more like a natural study where you have a situation where advertisers are telling you how to either prevent or contain chip pan fires. And the IV conditions are sort of allocated to which television service you are provided with. Now, I don't understand UK television, especially in the 21st century, but my understanding was that you had to pay a certain fee, even for standard television, back in the 1980s. And these are some of the service providers in the UK. Companies like Harlech, Tyne Tees, and a control group, which I think means that you either didn't have a television or you were in a region, more likely it meant you were in a region that had a different service provider that didn't run the ad campaigns. Now, these ad campaigns ran for many, many years, and they even had a lingering effect in certain areas. So you'll see that during the campaign, in all three conditions, there were dramatic reductions in the number of chip pan fires, and we even see a slight reduction in the control group, which might be a little surprising. But then again, this is not like a super controlled study. I mean, it's quite possible that somebody who lives in one region went to a friend's house to watch a football match, which is UK for soccer, by the way, and saw the chip pan fire advertisement. And the effectiveness is clear. It varies from region to region, but it is a very convincing case that advertising works. Now, there is an argument to be made that sometimes you could advertise too much and therefore you become a little bit, I don't know, numb to the information. If the ads are oversaturating the ad market, people start to tune it out. So there were some regions that showed two different types of commercials or adverts, I believe. One was for the prevention of a chip pan fire, and the other one was for the containment or how to react or put out, or not put out, but just to react to a chip pan fire. Something like you have to wet a tea towel, run to the tap, cover the pot with the tea towel. Don't add water. That'll make things much worse. So yeah, that's maybe due to the fact that people, again, are oversaturated with information. Another argument can be made is that, we don't plan accidents, but we could plan for the containment of an accident. So in other words, accidents by nature are accidental, whereas diminishing the damage from the accident is something you could actually plan out a little bit better, have prescribed actions to take. So the containment strategy might have been more effective than the prevention strategy. I haven't read this in a while, but you might want to look at the primary source to verify what I'm saying. And if you see any mistakes, please don't hesitate to put them in the comments below. I used to, I showed the students some examples of these commercials. Some ran in the 70s, some ran in the 80s. This is quite a longitudinal study. This was a long ad campaign. You ask anybody from England who grew up in this time, they could almost verbatim tell you the words in the commercial. I just quiz a friend and they'd be like, yeah, you run a tea towel under the tap. And I say, what's a tea towel? Anyway, you could go here on this very same platform, YouTube, and just type in chip pan fire advert and see some examples of these advertisements. One of them, the third one down here, even shows a disfigured woman, which you could argue could cause people to switch the station when that commercial comes on. That's a whole other conversation to have. So there are other ways to break down the data you can look at by region and see which were the most successful and which were the least successful. There's a lot of numbers here. My advice to you is maybe take one or two of them with you to the exam. For example, the Granada region showed a lot of success with when consumers were asked about what to do in the event of a chip pan fire. Many of them were able to say things like turn off the heat, cover with a damp cloth, etc. And your blue textbook points out that there was a 25% reduction at one point of reduction of chip pan fires in this region of Granada. So, this is not AS psychology where you're going to have to memorize as much information because there's almost 60 studies, depending on what what electives you're doing. If it's abnormal health, consumer, or organizations, there's a lot of data there. So choose the data or the data, depending on which pronunciation you like, that you think will be useful in making a point. If you're making a point about how effective this campaign was, you probably want to show a pretty high number of reductions. Granada, again, reduction of 25% overall. If you want to know more nuanced information, during the consumer surveys, what people were able to say was a good prevention containment strategy, you could pause the screen here and memorize some of this. Good luck with that. Okay, so just to summarize, today we looked at health and safety and the three sub-topics beneath that. Accidents at work that have to do with operator machine systems, reducing accidents through token economy, and using TV adverts or campaigns to increase safety. Honestly, I'm not sure why they chose the chip pan fire thing, because when I think of organizations, I think of things like corporations and things where there's some sort of command structure and leadership structure. But this is what Cambridge gave us to work with. Returning real quick to the initial dash there, machine operator systems or operator machine systems. Keep in mind, again, that different textbooks or different teachers are going to use different source material to talk about this topic. So, for example, in the black textbook, they mentioned a 3 Mile Island incident like we did here. The blue textbook talks about Riggio, and the purple book introduces the more recent work by James Reason. There's other names mentioned, Chaponis, Nagel. I think those are the only ones in the black book. So pick one, which book you trust the most. I think they're all good. They all have their strengths and they all have their weaknesses. And remember, the A2 exam is different than the AS exam. The A2 exam is more about show me what you know. It's less of like a quiz show than AS, which AS plays a lot of gotcha games, like haha, you didn't know that. Whereas A2 is more about showing what you can demonstrate. I don't know if that makes sense. But anyway, let me wrap it up here because I tend to ramble. Have a good day. More videos coming. Bye bye.